Now that I've got these platforms working, the next thing I need to do is add in some kind of scrolling. At the moment you can see the player just gets to the top of the screen and that's pretty much it. If I'm bouncing on this top platform you can't even see him anymore. What I want to do is have some kind of imaginary line defined on this game window that when the player reaches it, everything scrolls and he can just keep jumping indefinitely. Now to do that, I need to create an additional variable. I'll name this variable scroll_thresh. So that's short for the scroll threshold, and I will set that to 200 pixels. And just so we can visualize what this all looks like, I'm going to draw a temporary, well, it's going to be an imaginary line, but I'm going to draw it onto the screen for now, just to see what it all looks like. Now I'll go into my game loop, and underneath where I've got my background, I will add a little section to say draw temporary scroll threshold. And for this I will use pygame.draw.line. It will be on the screen. The color I'll use is white, and I need to give it 2 coordinates, so the starting point and the ending point of this line. Now the starting point is going to be on the left hand side of the screen, so x coordinate is 0, y coordinate is the scroll threshold, and the end point, well, that's going to go all the way to the right hand side of the screen, therefore the x coordinate is the screen width and the y coordinate is still the scroll threshold. So you don't actually need to do this part of it, but it just helps to visualize what's happening. Now if I run this code again, you can see there's a line here running across the screen. So what will happen is, as soon as the player's rectangle reaches that line, that's when we trigger this scrolling, and that's when we move everything else. Now the scrolling itself is going to be controlled by another variable. So this first variable that I added at the top here, that was my threshold for when I begin to scroll. But now I need another variable, which I will just call scroll. But this is going to be in smaller letters, whoops, scroll, and I'll set that to 0. Now this variable is going to be changing as the game goes on. So this is what's going to control how far everything moves. So now if I go back into my player class, I have this update method. Now remember I said that essentially the way this is going to work is that when the player's rectangle reaches this line, that's when everything scrolls. So that means that I need to add in an extra check within this move method, where the player moves up and down on the screen, and I'm currently doing the collision, that if the rectangle hits that line, that's when we control the scroll variable. So just at the bottom here of this method then, I've got all of these collision checks here. So I've got collision for the edges of the screen, collision with the platforms, and the collision with the ground. So underneath all of that, once all the collision checks are done, I need to add in another check. And I'll add a comment to say, check if the player has bounced to the top of the screen. And this is just going to be done in the same way I described. I'm going to be checking the top of the rectangle, so self.rect.top. So if the top of the rectangle has gone above that threshold line, now remember, because this is a y coordinate, that means that the rectangle top must be less than that 200 variable. So if it's less than scroll threshold, well then I need to be able to scroll everything else relative to the player. So I can set my scroll variable to some kind of number. But what do I choose here? Well, essentially what's going to be happening is that the player is going to be moving up until they hit this variable, this line, and then the player stops and it's everything else that moves. So I know the speed that the player is moving up and down on the screen. That's my variable dy. So that means that I just need to set my scroll variable to the negative version of that. So if the player is moving up on the screen, well then I want everything else to move down. So whatever the player's y velocity is, this dy variable, I want my scroll variable to be the opposite of it. And now lastly, I will need to make sure that I return this from my method here. So underneath all of this, we add in a return and return the scroll variable. Now one little mistake that I've made here, or something that I've missed, is I'm using the scroll variable here, but it's within the method. So I should really be resetting it and defining it right at the start. So right up here, I'll say scroll equals 0. Okay, so from this now, nothing's going to change. I can still jump to this point, but what I should be able to do is take this variable that's being returned out of this move method within my game loop. So if we go back down here, I've got jumpy.move here, and at the moment that's not returning anything, but I can get that back. So I can say scroll equals, and it will return that into this variable here. And just to make sure that it's actually working before I go too far ahead, I will just debug this. I'll run print scroll, And now when I get to that point, I should just be seeing zeros the whole time. But as soon as I get to that point, I should be seeing some kind of value. And there you go. As soon as he jumps over it, it does register that it needs to scroll. So I know that it's triggering correctly. Now I need to actually use that number and move everything else. What I want to move first of all are the platforms. So I'll come back to the background, but first I'll move the platforms. Now I already have a method up here. No, actually I don't. I've got my class and I've got my init method. So what I need to do is add in an update method to my platforms. So the update method is where I'm going to be able to control their position. So we'll say within here, define update. The first argument is going to be self, and then the second one is going to be scroll. So that's that same variable. I'm now going to be providing it as an argument to the update method within my platform class. And this method is going to grow over time, but for now, all I need to do is add one line here or a comment first to say update platforms vertical position. And we just say self.rect.y, so the y coordinate of the platform's rectangle is going to be increased by the scroll variable. Now I can go into my game loop and actually call this method. So I've created my temporary platforms here within this for loop, but I don't have anything within here to actually control them. I do have a section that draws them onto the screen because they're in a sprite group, but I don't have anything calling the update method for them. So let's add a section up here. So this is just below my temporary scroll threshold line and above where I'm drawing my sprites. I'll say update platforms. And I can call that group again. So I can say platform underscore group. And this time I call the update method. It's not screen, it's going to be scroll. So the sprite group automatically has, because I've inherited from the sprite class, it automatically has a draw and an update method. But the update method starts off empty. So because I have now added in some information into it and some functionality, I can still call that from the platform group, and it will just run that update method. I don't need to run and say for and iterate through them with a for loop. I can just call it on the entire group. So now if I run this again, and I go up to that line, you see it does kind of work. So everything does scroll up, or rather everything does scroll down, but then it comes back up again. And the reason that's all happening is because when the player falls back down the screen, I'm still registering a scroll. So what I actually need to be doing is only scrolling the screen when the player is jumping up the way. When he's falling back down, I don't really want everything to go back up against him. So we can fix that if we go back into the player class and into the move method. So where I'm updating this scroll section here, where I've added check if the player's bounced to the top of the screen, I can just add another little check within here. Now I only want the scroll to register when the player is jumping. So I'll add a comment to say if player is jumping, and if the player is jumping, well that means that his y velocity is negative. It's less than 0 because he's moving up the screen. So I can just say if self vel underscore y is less than 0, only then do I want to change this scroll variable. So if we run this again and I go to the top of the screen, you can see it's working a bit better now. So I'm pushing everything up and they're not coming back down again. So it's starting to come together. But there is still a little bit of an issue, which is that the player, when he gets to that point, he still seems to go through the line. He's not really supposed to, everything else has to move against him, but he's kind of supposed to just freeze in place, because otherwise he still goes to the top of the screen. So what I'm actually wanting to do is when the player gets to that point, is I want to freeze him in that position. I don't want him to be able to move anymore. Now his y velocity is what controls his vertical position. So at this point, I'm always saying that his rectangle's y coordinate is adjusted by this dy variable. However, when I am scrolling, I don't want him to be able to move. I want him to freeze on the position on that screen. So I can simply add that scroll variable back in here, because remember the scroll variable is negative dy. So what will happen is whenever the scroll variable is greater than 0 or less than 0, i.e. the player has reached that scroll threshold, well, this is going to cancel it out. So it's going to essentially say dy plus minus dy. So this section will become equal to 0 and the player will effectively freeze in his position on the screen. So if I run this again, oh, those platforms are too far apart to jump. Run this again, I go up there and you can see I get to that point and he almost like he kind of pushes it up with his head. so he gets stuck against it. And that's the effect that I'm going for with this. Now, I know that's not quite perfect because I run out of platforms when I get to the top, but I'm going to come back to that later on. What I want to do just now is complete this scrolling part and add the background scroll. So right now, everything that moves is just the platforms, and that seems to be working well, but the sky doesn't move with it, and that kind of ruins part of the effect. So to move everything together, I need to essentially just do the exact same thing that I've done for the background. So if I go into my main game loop, my background is drawn here. I've got the section here where I'm just blending it onto the screen. However, there's going to be an issue with that, which is that the background is, well, it's only so tall. Eventually, if I keep scrolling it, the background's going to go off the top of the screen. So I need to have an infinite scrolling background. Now I'll build this up and I'll explain what's going on at the same time. First of all, I'm going to replace this with a function. So I'll go back up to the top of the game where I've got my player class being created. So just before I create the classes, I'm going to create my functions. I'll add a comment to say function for drawing the background. I'll say define draw underscore bg, and this is going to take the scroll argument. In fact, let's just add it in now just to see why it doesn't work this way. And now I'll go back down. I should just copy this to start with, but I will move this out of here. So cut that, and I'll replace that with draw underscore bg, which is this function I have just created, and then I will put that argument of scroll into it. So now it's going to be taking that argument and running this function. Go back up to that function itself, and I'll just paste in what I just copied out of there. So that was screen.blit, the background image, at the coordinate of 0, 0. Now, of course, if I want this to scroll, I want to be able to change this y coordinate, and that's where the scroll variable comes into it. So we add on scroll. So let's run this and see how it works. I'll go to that line up there, and it doesn't seem to quite work. You notice it doesn't really scroll. It just moves a little bit with the player, and then it comes back down to where it was. So it almost just shifts temporarily up, and it comes back down again. So it's still following the player. There's just a little bit of a delay when he hits that line. So why is that happening? Well, the platforms I'm able to control with the scroll variable because they have a defined y coordinate. Their rectangle is what stores their y position, and I just adjust it by adding or subtracting from it. The background, however, is always just drawn at a fixed coordinate. So I always just say draw it at 0, x coordinate, and then 0 plus scroll on the y coordinate. Now the scroll variable is only going to be whatever the speed of the player is up and down the screen. So it's not going to move the background at any time. As the scroll variable goes back to 0, well, this is just going to draw the background back in the top left corner where it was. So that's why it kept resetting, as you saw there. What I actually need to do is have a different way of controlling my background scroll. And for that, I will define an additional variable up in this section here where I've got my game variables. I will call this one bg underscore scroll and set it to 0. So now we've got this variable defined. I go down to my draw background function and I need to change this to bg underscore scroll. And same in here, just to differentiate between the two scroll variables. So if I go back into my game loop, this is where I need to actually define this background scroll. So up here is where I get my immediate scroll variable. So this is just basically the player's up or down velocity, but it's the negative version of it. But the background needs a cumulative scroll. So I actually need to take the scroll variable that I get, and I need to keep adding it up overall. So I say that my bg underscore scroll variable is itself plus scroll. So essentially, as long as the game keeps going, this variable is just going to keep increasing. And if I print it out, you'll be able to see this variable is just going to keep going up and up, while the scroll variable is just going to keep resetting back to 0 whenever the player falls away from that threshold. Now the other thing I need to do is just change this here to make sure that I'm sending bg underscore scroll through to my background. So let's run this and see what happens. Now if I go back up to that line there, well, it's kind of worked. The background is scrolling, but something really weird is going on up here. The reason this is all happening is because my background, which was here, is now gone. So now there's nothing here. There is no background anymore. Essentially, it's just leaving everything that was there. It's not able to refresh it because the background that was drawn in the top left corner is now shifted all the way down. And this is what I meant when I said that I would need to have infinite scrolling on the background. So just to show what's going on, I'm going to print the scroll variable again. So you'll be able to see down here, it's 0. When I go to that threshold, it pops up, but then it goes back down to 0 again. So every time I hit that line, it pops up a little bit and then goes back down to 0. But if I print my bg_scroll, starts at 0, and then I go up and I hit that line, and you see it just keeps adding up. It keeps moving cumulatively. So now my background is actually shifted down the screen by 430 pixels. So there's space above it which is missing a background. Now the way I'm going to create this infinite background is, well, basically I'm just going to have the same image drawn twice on top of itself. So when one of them, or essentially when I scroll, I'm going to move both of them down against themselves. So I go back up to my draw background function here, and I'll just copy this line down underneath it. So now I'm going to draw 2 backgrounds, not 1. But my second background isn't going to be drawn in the same position. It's going to be drawn above the first one. So the backgrounds are 600 pixels tall. That's just how big the image is. So if I want them on top of each other, I need the second one to be offset on the y-coordinate by 600 pixels. I've drawn a little image here to explain what is actually happening. So these are my 2 backgrounds. This up here is this black outline is my game window. So essentially what I'm saying is I've got my actual main background here, and this is what you're going to be seeing through the game. But what you're not going to be seeing is that there's another one of them just above it. And what happens is as I scroll, both of these are going to be moving down together with each other. So that's going to give me the impression of constant scrolling. So essentially, I'm never going to run out of background because this second one is going to come in behind it. So let's try that. I've got my bg_scroll variable and I've got these 2 backgrounds. So if I run, if I jump up here now, you see I'm not facing that same problem. So now I am getting a continuous background. Of course, I can't keep going to test it because I don't have any more platforms. But I suppose I could quickly generate them just to show what happens when I reach the top of that second background. So here, my max platforms variable, I just need to adjust this. You don't need to tweak this, I'm just doing this to demonstrate. So if I keep going past the second background, why didn't that work? What have I done wrong? So within this section, I'm generating a whole bunch of platforms. Oh yeah, of course, they're being generated from the top of the screen down. So I guess temporarily I could just say -1000. See if that helps. Not quite. -800. Maybe. Let's try that again. No, I don't think I'll be able to reach the top of that without really fixing this platform generation properly. Okay, maybe this time. Oh yeah, okay, that looks better. So now I keep going and I still have that problem. So I got to this point and I still have this same issue as before. And that's happening, you might have already guessed by this point, because I did have 2 backgrounds, but now I've moved them both down. So there's no third background behind it. So what I could do is just have infinite backgrounds, just constantly drawing more and more of them. But instead what I'm going to do is, within this section, I'm going to keep this exactly the same. But when I get past the height of 600 pixels with my background scroll, I'm just going to reset it back. So essentially, when both of these platforms have moved all the way down the screen, and this one takes the place of this one, then I'm going to reset that scroll variable and push them back to how they were. And that's going to give me an endless background. So to do that, I just go to my main game loop, and where I've got this section here for bg_scroll, I just add another little check. So I need to say here, if that variable bg_scroll has gone beyond or is equal to 600 pixels, which is just the height of my image. So I suppose I could just use a different variable here. I could just get the height of that image in case you've got a different size of background. But for now, this will do. Then I need to reset that bg_scroll variable back to 0. And everything else stays the same. Now, I'm not sure if this will work because I did have a bit of trouble with those platforms. Let's see. Maybe on this one, if I can do it. Okay, so this might be okay. And yeah, I just keep jumping and you can see there's no issue. I've gone to the top and the backgrounds are still there. So let me just fix these platforms, get rid of this before I go too much further because that did mess it up a little bit. And that's pretty much all there is to scrolling. So everything else, or rather everything for scrolling, is now working well. I still need to fix these platforms and have them automatically generate, but that's going to take a little bit longer, so I'm going to do that in the next video. So for now, thanks for watching.